Okay. Hopefully you can hear me. We are going to do the entirety. I think I'm recording, right? Yes. We are going to do the entire 60s in 45 minutes or less. So, here we go. So, 3 big points for the 1960s. Number 1, this is the ultimate peak of tensions with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We're going to see things like the Vietnam War, the space race, and the infamous Cuban Missile Crisis. At that same time, the nation is being rocked by the growing civil rights movement, which is really going to peak during the 60s and 70s. And then on the home front as well, we've got this growing and spreading cultural movement, which we call the hippies. So we're going to meet the worst band in world history. I despise them, the Beatles. I can't stand the Beatles. They're so overrated and they're terrible people. Anyways. So we're going to first talk about incident. We're going to talk about tensions with the Soviets, civil rights movement, then the hippies. So to start off with, in 1960, there's this really embarrassing incident where an American spy plane, they're called a U-2, kind of like I think it's a band or a song maybe, by Luftballons, I don't know. So it's flying over the Soviet Union, and it's this plane that flies really high and really fast. So the Soviets know we're spying on them, but they can't really prove it or stop it. But this plane actually gets shot down first time over Russia. The pilot, Gary Powers, is captured, and this is really embarrassing. Number 1, we look like we are a bunch of jerks, and we look incompetent. Number 2, it makes the Soviets think, well, goodness gracious, they're spying on us. We don't want to ease tensions. We gotta do something about this. So there have been these plans to have our president and their premier meet and talk things over and get along, kumbaya, which at this time would have been JFK. But they get canceled. So we're about to see this massive spike, starting with the U-2 incident, of tensions between the Soviets and the United States. Just a year after that is the Bay of Pigs. So this is a very pixelated picture of Cuba, that island nation just south of Florida and just east of the Gulf of Mexico and north of the Caribbean. Cuba, if you recall, we had, if you want to call it conquered, liberated, whatever you want to call it, in the Spanish-American War, we had taken over Cuba. We had kind of given up on that, though, and let Cubans govern themselves. They had a dictator. The dictator was then, who is aligned with us, was then thrown out by a communist revolution led by this guy right here on the right, Fidel Castro. We hated Fidel Castro. So, and we also had a very large number of Cuban immigrants who lived in Florida who were constantly pressuring the American government to do something about this. So John F. Kennedy and the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, make this plan to try to overthrow Castro, secretly. So what we do is we set up these training camps down in Florida, and then we take a bunch of Cuban immigrants who are volunteer for this. It's not very secret. The Cubans know all about this. And then we train them as basically like paramilitary insurgents. And the plan is to have these unmarked boats with no American symbols on it, unmarked planes with no American symbols on it, and insert them into Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, hence the name, the Bay of Pigs invasion. And then they were going to scatter into the countryside, start a revolution against Castro, and overthrow the communists, all with plausible deniability. Like, oh, we're not involved. And they don't even make it off the beach. All the planes that were supposed to help them showed up at the wrong time because of the time zone difference. They didn't think about that. They had no directions, and then the Cuban army just wipes them out pretty much, makes them all surrender. It's really embarrassing, and we do get these prisoners back, but believe it or not, we have to pay the Cubans money, and we have to pay a ransom in, believe it or not, baby formula and milk, which is weird to think about. But anyways, the big impact is that the Bay of Pigs, besides embarrassing America, pushes the Cubans into the Soviet arms. So before this, the Castro had been playing kind of hard to get with the Soviet Union. But after this, he realizes he needs a big, strong person to back him up. Otherwise, the United States is going to keep coming after him. That is going to directly lead us into our next incident, the Berlin Wall, and then after that, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So 1961, following the Bay of Pigs, following U2, the Soviets decided to make the Iron Curtain legit in Berlin. So Berlin, just like Europe, is split. East Berlin is under Soviet control. West Berlin is under Allied control. And the Soviets were really embarrassed by the fact that people kept on fleeing East Berlin and East Germany and escaping into West Germany, because West Germany and West Berlin were obviously much better places to live. So they decided they're fed up, they're mad with all the stuff going on, and they're embarrassed, so they literally build a wall, a giant wall, completely encasing West Berlin. This is, there's a Tom Hanks movie where they talk about it. This area, if you look in the picture on your right, that's the wall. That area in front of them with like the barbed wire, it would get mined. It's called the death strip. If somebody's trying to flee through the death strip, the Russian guards will shoot them and kill them. So the Berlin Wall becomes this absolute iconic symbol of the Cold War. It'll eventually be torn down. I've ever heard of Ronald Reagan's famous "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." That'll be later. But just know the Berlin Wall is very symbolic of the divide between East and West. This is again a picture of that so-called zone of death. So immediately after this, the world almost blows up. So in 1962, a year after the Berlin Wall goes up, and a year after, or 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, excuse me, what am I saying? A year after the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, there we go, we get the Cuban Missile Crisis. So here's the problem. So the Soviets are like, well, if America wants to play dirty and spy on us, we're gonna try to trick them. So what they do is they secretly place ballistic missiles carrying nuclear weapons in Cuba. Why the heck are they doing this? Number one, they want to do this to to kind of tie Cuba to them. Number two, by placing them in the big one, I should say, number one, the big one, I may have flip-flopped them, is that they are putting the missiles there because when they're directly next to the United States, if they were to launch those missiles, we would have almost no time to react to those missiles and get people into bunkers or defend ourselves or launch missiles back at the Soviets. So we kind of had something like this in Turkey, where we had missiles in Turkey that could hit Moscow in 5 minutes. So the Soviets are now doing that in Cuba. President John F. Kennedy, this is where John F. Kennedy rises to fame in the national mythology, is he sends the U.S. Navy to blockade Cuba. He says, look, because the Soviets deny that the ICBMs are there until we get these photos from spy planes. And then at the United Nations, we're like, do you deny that there are missiles in Cuba? Soviet ambassadors like, yes, we deny it. This is American lies. And then they pull out the receipts, so to speak. And they pull out and they show all these global world leaders these photos that prove that it's there. So it's this huge confrontation. So the American Navy blockades Cuba. No Soviet, we say, you cannot send anything else to Cuba. They say, well, we're going to do it anyways. So the Russian Navy starts heading over across the Pacific Ocean, and we're waiting for them. And for 13 days, they're steaming across the Pacific towards the Panama Canal. Things are going to go down if they show up. And for 13 days, Americans are looking to the skies. They're listening for air raid warnings. People are so ready for a nuclear war that will be the end of our civilizations. However, finally, the Soviets turn back and the Cuban Missile Crisis is over. That seems sudden. Well, behind the scenes, John F. Kennedy and his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, uncle, not the father, but I think uncle to the RFK Jr., who is now the Secretary of Health, I think, the vaccine guy. I think that's his uncle, not his dad. Either way. So what they did was they were the first ones to set up the so-called hotline. So there's a red telephone. It's still there, but it's obviously updated, in the Oval Office that you can pick up the phone. So the current president, Donald Trump, could pick up the phone and speak directly to the Russian leader Vladimir Putin at any time. What this does is it kind of avoids an escalating chain where we're not really sure what the Russians are doing or going on, or there might be a misunderstanding. So instead of guessing the Russian intentions, you can just pick up the phone, call them, and say, yo, what's the deal? So this is seen as a victory for the United States of America. It makes John F. Kennedy incredibly popular. It hurts Soviet prestige on the world stage. But at the same time, we don't really talk about it. We remove our missiles from Turkey. So it's a symbolic American victory, but the real negotiating, we both give up something. Anyways, this is that missile base in Turkey. You can see how close it was to Moscow, relatively speaking. And this is something that was often seen in newspapers at the time, was like, look how close these Russian missiles are to our cities. Like, Miami would be wiped out before anybody could do anything about it. Yeah, there's John F. Kennedy looking heroic. U.S. blockades Cuba, tells the Rus to lay off. Wow, what an American hero. That's a political cartoon. This is like MAD, mutually assured destruction. That's JFK. He's got the button that he could press at any time to our hydrogen bombs, which will blow up the Russians, but they also have the button to their hydrogen bombs, which will blow us up, and it's all about who's going to blink first. And as you can see, John F. Kennedy is only shown. I mean, it's kind of like the Chad versus the loser memes, you know what I'm talking about? It's like the guy with like a sharp jawline and hair, and he's got that sharp John F. Kennedy jawline. He's looking him in the eyes, and only a single bead of sweat. Versus, not Gorbachev. I don't remember. Khrushchev, perhaps, who's sweating buckets and is shaking like a leaf. So just a quick shout out to this guy, Vasily Arkhipov. Famous story. I'm sure Andrew Franklin would love to recount it to us sometime. So there was a Soviet submarine keeping eyes secretly on the American Navy off of Cuba. Now the American Navy doesn't know they're there. So they start practicing what they would do if there was a submarine. So they start practicing depth charges, which are basically these bombs you drop in the water that sink down towards a submarine and explode to sink them. Now, we don't know the Russian sub is right there. So we start doing that to practice. So the Russians like, oh my God, they know we're here. They're trying to sink us. And this was a ballistic submarine, so it had nuclear missiles on it. So they decide, let's launch our missiles. Let's attack the United States. Like they declared war on us. We need to launch our missiles. You need all three of your officers on the ship to approve it. It's like that famous key thing you got to put the keys in. The captain approved it. The other officer approved it. Vasily Arkhipov does not. He says, I don't think this is an actual attack. I think it's a drill. Let's wait and see what happens. They get furious at him, but he refuses. He stands his ground, and it is because of him that we averted World War III and the destruction of both the United States, in the entirety of Europe, the entirety of Asia, and all of Russia. So one man's decision actually could have almost certainly averted a global catastrophe. So good for you, Vasily Arkhipov. Now, infamously following this, John F. Kennedy will be assassinated in Dallas, Texas by Lee Harvey Oswald. That's his wife, Jackie Kennedy. John F. Kennedy cheated on her all the time. Marilyn Monroe, I mean, in theory, he was not a great husband. I'll say that for sure. He's assassinated. It's a crying shame for the nation. And then LBJ will come in. So, but talking about the culture wars. So not only are we competing with the Soviets in the political sense, we're also competing with them in every other sense. So if you've ever heard of the Miracle on Ice, we compete with them in the Olympics, we compete with them in the space race, in movies, even in something like chess. The Russians famously are very good at chess. There's this famous American master, Fischer, who takes them on, and it's this whole thing. We're showing, we are competing everywhere. If you've ever seen Rocky IV with Victor Drago, you will lose. That guy. Or ever seen the original Red Dawn? We are competing with the Soviets in every facet. Everything in our culture is bent upon being better than the Russians, being better than the other guy. Now, sadly for Andrew Franklin, we're not spending much time on the space race. However, all we're really going to shout out is that this is like the big money sink besides the military during the 60s and 70s. We get NASA. We had actually brought over a lot of Nazi rocket scientists under Operation Paperclip following World War II. And we're losing in the space race for a while. The Soviets get the first satellite called Sputnik, and this is massive, and it's like, oh my God, communists are above us now. It's a huge shock to the American people. They then beat us to have the first person in space with Yuri Gagarin. But finally, we beat them to the moon with Apollo 11. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are the first men, the first Americans, the first humans to walk on the moon. You know, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And no, don't be a dummy. The moon landing was not faked. We went to the moon. Don't be a buffoon. I think that's Neil. That might be Buzz. I'm not sure. Buzz Armstrong is still alive, actually. Buzz Lightyear, the movie character, is named after him. I think Buzz Aldrin's still alive. Pretty sure. I hope he's not dead. That'd be a crying shame. So, now we're going to talk about the American society during the 1960s. So, it went JFK, Nixon, LBJ, I think. Either way, a bunch of old dudes. So, Nixon is president now. What Richard Nixon decides to do is he wants to fix some of the problems he sees in American society. He comes up with this huge program of reforms that he calls the Great Society. The idea is that it's almost an extenuation of the New Deal of FDR. If there's ever a question about this, you could kind of connect it back to the New Deal, where he is going to tackle nationwide poverty and especially tackle racial injustice. So what he wants to do is lift the nation out of poverty. He says, look, we can't say we're better than the Soviets if such a huge portion of our country is dirt poor. It doesn't have a good quality of life. So there's massive federal programs to lift huge portions of the country out of the crippling poverty they were in, especially minority communities, and more specifically, African Americans. This is also where we see the rise of Medicare and Medicaid, and the federal government is going to continue to expand. The Great Society will become the buzzword of the day for how we should be viewing the nation and how all things should be put into perspective about, is this helping us become a great society? Again, still a part of that context of competition with the Soviets. Oh, we got to be better than the Soviets at home as well as up in space, militarily, everything. But this is just, I wanted to put that. Now Vietnam. So, Vietnam used to be a French colony called Indochina. Following World War II, North Vietnam especially was very communist under Ho Chi Minh. They start leading a anti-colonial revolution. They don't want to fight America. Ho Chi Minh actually really loves America, believe it or not. He loved the United States. He thought we were going to be their allies. The French start losing badly. Famously, at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, they get crushed by Vietnamese forces. So, here's what happens next. They're getting beat up. They decide to call up their old buddies, the United States, and say, hey, can you guys come help us? We don't want these communists taking over. All we hear is that word communist. We're in. Remember, containment theory, domino theory. So American troops start slowly filtering into Vietnam. It's a slow trickle at first. It's like, it's just a few soldiers. They're just there to advise the South Vietnamese and the French. Until eventually, in 1964, there's this incident where supposedly these American naval ships are attacked by North Vietnamese little speedboats, and this is used as a pretext to basically start a full-scale war in Vietnam. Now, it doesn't come out until years later that the Gulf of Tonkin was falsified, made up. Didn't really happen the way that they said it happened. And so this is going to be this will not come out until years and years later. And a lot of people from that era don't really even acknowledge that Gulf of Tonkin was kind of made up. For example, my grandfather, Vietnam veteran, you can't talk to him about the causes or justifications for the war. He gets very offended if you talk about the Gulf of Tonkin specifically. Anyways, so 1964 is when America really gets in there and it becomes the Vietnam War that you think of in pop culture. So Vietnam is a anti-guerrilla war. So there's not really Vietnamese armies except for North Vietnam, but where a lot of the fighting, the most famous fighting takes place is down here in South Vietnam with the Viet Cong. These are the guerrilla forces who are blending into the local population and carrying out ambushes and raids. So Vietnam, from the get-go, is really unpopular, and there's a couple reasons. Number one, there's really unclear goals. We don't go in there and we aren't saying we are going to retake Quang Tri and then the war will be over, or we are going to capture Hanoi. It's unclear what we're doing there besides just racking up a body count of dead Americans and dead Vietnamese people. Nobody really knows what the heck we're doing. So that's reason number one. It's really popular. It's like that term, moving the goalposts. We keep changing the goalposts of what victory means and what we're doing in Vietnam. And then the draft. The draft kicks up in high gear, and people do not want to be drafted for this war. And then third, this is one of the first widely televised wars. You've got reporters on the front lines taking pictures, taking videos of dead Americans and of the atrocities that are happening to American soldiers and being committed by American troops. So, for example, the My Lai massacre, an entire village is wiped out, women are raped, it's terrible, committed by a platoon of American soldiers. All of those guys would later be acquitted. But photos of things like that make it back home to the news, and people are devastated. They're irate. They're angry. So Vietnam is going to fuel not only the civil rights movement, but the hippie movement, the growing hippie movement that the baby boomers will be a part of. We'll talk about the end of the war when we get to the 70s. But this is a picture of Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam. These are some photos from the war. I want to note, you'll notice how there's helicopters. This is the first war with helicopters in it. Just showcases, we're 20 years out from World War II. We've got color photographs. We've got assault rifles. We've got helicopters. Some of your grandparents probably fought in this war. My grandfather did, and my other grandfather was in the Marines at this time, but he didn't go to Vietnam. And this is some of the protests. End the war now, bring the troops home. The protests back home were massive. People and here's call back to the Great Society. War erodes the Great Society. That whole prism of viewing our actions through that competition with the Soviets. This is another famous photo where there's a protest. The guard is there. And then this lady puts the flour into the barrel of the gun. That's super, super famous stuff. Anywho's, this is the Vietnam Memorial. It's in Washington, D.C. You can go see it. Has the name of every single American killed in Vietnam. Very powerful stuff when you get there. It's about 60,000 Americans who will die in the Vietnam War. And this is just another map. If you want to take a look at this, it has some more info. You can pause it, look at it. We don't need to spend a lot of time right here. So, hippies. Who the heck are they? Well, the hippies are a counterculture movement. Counterculture means any movement or group or of culture which is pushing back on the predominant viewpoint. So it's the youth pushing back against those old fuddy-duddies who are getting us into Vietnam. So these are the baby boomers, who today are our politicians, because they still want to keep running at the age of 80 and 90, and the old people. Your grandparents were probably baby boomers. My grandparents were silent generation, silent generation, I believe. So, like I just said, Vietnam has a huge impact on the hippie movement. What are they all about? Well, they're all about having sex. They're all about sticking it to the man. They're all about smoking weed, preserving the environment, and that's the hippies for you. They're also really famous because they popularize using music as one of your primary ways of protest against the man, so to speak. This is where that phrase, make love, not war, man, comes from. And of course, they become famous for their colorful floral outfits, again, pushing back against the more drab fashion of the day. They're almost like flappers on a greater scale. But you could connect them to the flappers, hint, hint, on a DBQ or an LEQ. These are the Beatles. The Beatles were Beatlemania starts in 1962. These were the most famous hippie band. They sweep the nation. They inspire people to dress like them, to enjoy their terrible, god-awful, awful music. I hate the Beatles. They're such a bad band, and they're all god-awful people. Anyways, can't stand the Beatles, but Beatlemania. And then just some more photos of hippies. Fashion. I mean, that guy on the right, he's kind of putting it on. He really is. I mean, normally I wouldn't recommend denim on denim, but he's got it on. So, on to the civil rights movement. So, the two most famous leaders are Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Obviously, we've all heard of Martin Luther King. You may or may not have heard of Malcolm X. So, Martin Luther King's philosophy is all about peaceful protest. He wants to showcase the wrongs that are being done to African Americans by protesting, and not by protest like picket like signs, boycotts. He doesn't want to be going out there and using force. It's all about peaceful protest, and famously that term, civil disobedience. Martin Luther is also okay and wants white people to join in with his movement. Now, sadly, he will be killed in 1968. Opposing Martin Luther, and not as famous as Martin Luther, is Malcolm X. That was not his original name. He changed his name to X. I don't remember his first name. It's kind of like how Muhammad Ali changed his name to Muhammad Ali, kind of like reclaim a sense of identity, because the last name was the name of the slave owners who had brought his family over in the 1800s. So Malcolm X is all about forming almost a black America. He does not want white people to be a part of the civil rights movement, and he wants black people to use force, if needed, to get their way. He thinks they've been betrayed for far too long by white America, and that even if white people support them, they're going to betray them in the end. So Malcolm X is really a big supporter of the Black Panther Party, which we will talk about later. But Malcolm X is like if Martin Luther King Jr. is the carrot, Malcolm X is the stick, so to speak. And he will be killed in 1965. So, the civil rights movement, this will be a doozy. I don't know if I'll be able to get this done before class. Maybe. Oh, hey, look. It's Xander. Hi, Xander. So, start in 1960. Now, remember, schools are no longer segregated. However, large portions of the rest of society are. So, there's this famous place, Woolsworth's Lunch Counter. It's this famous diner. African Americans decide they're gonna go protest there. So what they do is they go and they sit down in the white-only section, and they're not served. People harass them. They throw drinks at them. They attack them. But this gets published in the newspapers and on the news, just TVs now, and this spreads across the country. People are inspired. People decide that they want to be a part of this movement, and this is where we're going to start to see MLK really get onto the scene. MLK is a part of this, and eventually a lot of businesses are forced to, they're running, like, nobody wants to go there if there's a bunch of people protesting there, so they just say, whatever, we're done with segregation and our business, and they get rid of it. These are some photos of the protests. Like you can see, all the seats are being taken. These are supposedly white-only seats, but they're being taken by protesters. And here's some of them being harassed by people who are now 80 years old. being harassed for daring to, getting drinks poured on them, thrown at them for daring to sit there. So following that, we get the Freedom Riders. Freedom Riders are the term. So these people would get on, they'd get together in groups, and they'd get on buses. The buses they would get on were white only. They're segregated buses. But they'd book trips, and they would get on these buses, and they would travel like defiantly across the deep, deep South, like Klan territory, on these buses. Now, oftentimes the buses would be stopped, or when the buses did stop, they would get attacked by the police. They would get beat up by the Klan members. It was really dangerous. However, the fact that they're there on like the front lines really makes them famous, and it's across the nation. These are some examples of the Freedom Riders. You can see that with Martin Luther King's influence, it's not just a black-only movement. You'll see that white people as well are joining in on the movement. These are some more examples of the Freedom Riders. Freedom's wheels are rolling. And this is an infamous incident where a bus is attacked, like a Molotov cocktail gets thrown into the bus and nearly kills everybody in there. So, here is the most famous speech perhaps of the entirety of the 1900s. Martin Luther King leads a gargantuan march. Over 300,000, about 300,000 people march, literally walk to Washington, D.C. There at D.C. on the Mall in front of the Lincoln Memorial, the great emancipator, Martin Luther King delivers that "I have a dream" speech. This is iconic. This is so influential. Every American has heard this speech. At the time, every TV, every newspaper was reporting on this speech. This is so famous. And it's actually one of the things that historians look back on and say, yeah, that was definitely one of the reasons why that the Civil Rights Act gets passed in 1964. So, this is just a picture. That's the Washington Monument, and this is like an aerial photograph down at the mall in D.C. There he is giving his speech, very famous. I have a dream. He's wearing priest garb because he's a reverend. Just some more pictures of the march. So, 1964, LBJ passes officially the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act ends segregation at all. It ends segregation, not only in public, but also employment-wise. You cannot say, I don't want to hire you because you're X skin color, or you are gay, or you are Muslim. You can't do that. It is illegal. Illegal. Completely illegal. So this is super famous, and then a year later, you look at the Voting Rights Act, which will pretty much end those Jim Crow laws, which are restricting voting access. And then later, you look at the Fair Housing Act in '68, whose goal is to make it easier or to stop companies which were denying loans to black people simply because they were black, and try to help them get into homes. So the Civil Rights Act, I guarantee you've heard of it. This happens in 1964. There he is signing it. There he is shaking hands with Martin Luther King. He looks like FDR there, I have to say. Doesn't he look like Franklin Delano Roosevelt there? Something else I want to point out is, I know it's like a mix of different races here. You've got black people and white people. We'll talk about him later. I guess we'll just talk about him now. So Thurgood Marshall is the lawyer who argues in Brown v. Board of Education, and he becomes so famous from that LBJ is going to appoint him to the Supreme Court. So Thurgood Marshall is the first African American to become a member of the Supreme Court, and he will serve there for many years. Supreme Court justices serve for life. I think this is it for the 60s. This was a doozy, guys. So in 1965, we get the Watts riots. In LA, Los Angeles, people are mad. The LAPD has a long history of problems with police gangs and white supremacy and police violence. Now, there's this incident where a black man is killed. He was unarmed. Stop me if you've heard this before. And so people start protesting. The protests turn violent, and they turn into riots. So 34 people die. Over 1,000 are injured. And a big portion of the city is burned down. So as a result of the Watts riots, and infamously, LBJ, or I always mix up LBJ and Lincoln. The sheriff will be on a phone call, and he'll make this really racist remark about it, which then gets published out onto the news, and that infuriates people even more. So part of this is the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party is a black nationalist group who are arming themselves, and they believe that there could be no cooperation with white America, and that they need to make a separate black America, and they need to claim their rights for themselves, that you can't trust the police. This is where that slogan Black Power comes from. It is about black nationalism. It's about pushing back. It's the opposite of Martin Luther King's, holding out your hand in the open way. The Black Panther Party is like closed fist, like we're gonna get our rights one way or another. That's it for the 60s. 65 to 70, the Vietnam War is going on. People are killing each other. Same as always. Whew, that was a doozy. We got there though. Next up is the 70s.